I made the decision to go to Kiev last year after watching footage of the protests on the Maidan Square for days. There was a visual element to the protests that really stood out. Demonstrators were afraid of attacks by the police, and they had reasons to be. And as a result, the architecture of Kiev was in a lot of places remodeled to offer that protection. I began exhaustive photographic documentation of the Maidan upon arrival last February. It just so happened that my week there was wedged between flare-ups and violence. Only a few days after I left the city, the most violent period of the protest movement began. But looking back, I'm really proud of what I did witness, the protest site really before most of the violence. From my vantage point at the United Nations, it's impossible not to see just how poorly this country has fared. But I also knew that Kiev had changed. I'd seen some of the photos of how the focal points of last year's protests were absorbed right back into the flow of daily life. This was the eerie contrast I wanted to explore, going back to these same sites that last year looked so medieval, and to now see them in the context of this bustling city. The changing landscape of Kreshchatyk Street, this is one of Kiev's main thoroughfares, was particularly shocking. There are really no visible clues of the military-style tents that lined this street, or the massive cauldrons of soup or the wood fires that were also there on the asphalt. In fact, in one shot, it's the interior of a tent belonging to volunteers from western Ukraine. The only identifying feature of Kiev is this faint mark of white paint on the floor, which is actually a center lane line on the street. During that week, the protest movement had incredible momentum. Volunteers were pouring in from all over the country. And I think the peaceful, hopeful spirit of the protests was really reaching its highest point. Of course, the police were there, the infamous Berkut special forces, but the scene was calm, and residents of Kiev basically wandered up onto the barricades to observe the standoff. Obviously, weapons and food and clothes and money were valuable. But there was this brief moment where ice, because it was the foundation of the barricades, because it was so cold, had this brief spike in value. And then, just as the ice would have melted in spring, the Euromaidan occupation ended in March, and Ukraine's fight for territorial integrity began in Crimea and in the eastern Donbas region. In the very same spot where the police had formed their barricades with protesters last year, there are now regular protests over Ukraine's collapsing banking system. At least a quarter of Ukraine's banks are now insolvent. And public anger isn't just focused on Russia, but it's pointed right back at the government. The transformation of the Maidan since last year is total. But Kiev still wears its grief. This was particularly clear along Institutskaya Street. When clashes turned violent last February, this was the shortest route for police to reach protesters from the government district just up the hill. As I documented last year, Institutskaya Street was patrolled and had barricades of its own, but it became one of the deadliest spots in the city. At least 7 protesters died on the street, including 4 at the hands of sniper fire. Where last year I saw political posters warning of the risk of abuse of power and violence by police, there are now candles and memorial ribbons. My name is Luke Vargas, and I'm a radio reporter and photojournalist with the Talk Radio News Service.